Sanders and Katie Halper.
That's quite the list.
Because they don't know what they're talking about. They don't. I'm done listening to actors and journalists who fucking watched a movie going around thinking that they know something. They don't fucking know anything, and I'm done like trying to coax them in the right direction.
Yo, but we watch the best movies. I mean, you should see the caliber of movie that we as journalists get to see. It's not, I think if you saw the caliber, like the cinematography, it's just...
That would change my mind.
Yeah, you'd be like, oh, I didn't realize this is like Spielberg quality. Okay.
Yeah, my bad. So anyway, that's my thing that I can't take anymore. And if it makes enemies or it closes certain doors, like those things just weren't doors anyway. That was an illusion.
I mean, that is kind of one of my great frustrations in trying to think about policy, because it seems like the demands that the activists make, and in this case, I think it's true on both sides, but obviously we're just focusing on the left in terms of the issues that we're passionate about dealing with. And in thinking about policy, the things that the activists on our side demand be treated as gospel sometimes just have nothing to do with effective policy or what might work in addressing the issue. And you're trapped because you're forced to try to solve a problem without doing the thing that would actually work, either because it's cut off or because it's not the thing everyone is saying you're supposed to do right now.
Yeah, and I mean, are you recording?
No, yeah. I'm recording this.
Because I mean, that's a decent lead-in to what we're talking about with Philando Castile. That the fundamental aspect that justice would be a conviction is preposterous.
Now, let me ask you, because you wrote in the aftermath of the of the release of the Facebook video, turning that story into a national story, a column in The Guardian where you said very frankly, at this point, after having watched this video, when people ask me how should one act to survive a car stop, I don't know what to tell them anymore. And do you feel like in this case, this is a situation where, putting aside just the reform issue for a moment, where a conviction wasn't warranted in the way you might have felt in perhaps other cases?
So I have a vicarious liability issue in this. So I think that it's unquestionable that what the officer did is criminal neglect. But on top of that, the supervisors and system that allow that to take place and allow such an individual incapable of handling what they're asking them to do, whether that's because what they're being asked to do is impossible or whether they've been insufficiently trained, is really a moot aspect of it. But that you put somebody out there and told them to do a job in the public that they were incapable of doing for a multitude of reasons. So you are also liable for that. And that's the vicarious liability is what we lose.
I agree with that. Part of my concerns in these conversations we've been having, especially in the last few episodes, is kind of the vicarious liability that we as a society hold. Speaking from my position as a journalist, being more on like the sort of a citizen side or civilian side of things. But there's no question that in a situation like this, there's an entire system that is implicated and that's not being addressed. And, especially with respect to car stops, you've mentioned in the past that you don't think officers necessarily need to be armed. And this is a situation where you have an officer who, as best as I can tell, his entire law enforcement career took place in the suburbs of St. Paul, Minneapolis, who is armed. And I can understand why in the presence of a gun, he might get fearful, especially with everything we know about implicit bias in our society. And now a young man is dead for no reason. Is this a good sort of illustration of that idea of why you think like reform such as this, we have to rethink about what is the role police play in our society and what we're asking them to do?
Yeah, I mean, fundamentally, that's kind of the issue that seems to be impeding our progress is that we're not asking that fundamental question in our policies of not like how do we mitigate an officer that has a gun and another person has a gun during this car stop. It's why don't we go a little bit further back, and say, why is there an armed state agent pulling over a car? So if our purpose is to enforce traffic regulations, why do we need a gun to enforce traffic regulations, just like we don't use guns to enforce parking regulations or alcohol regulations, things like that? I don't understand why we brought a gun into it to begin with. We're at least not really evaluating whether that is. This goes to well-being checks for somebody's health, for mental health issues, for my kid won't go to school. Why do we send a gun? Why do we send violence to a call of my kid won't go to school?
You know, one of the interesting aspects of this conversation that we've been having now, I think for a couple of weeks, is the question of our just general acceptance of the idea that violence is an acceptable way of solving problems. And obviously this has roots in some of our religious traditions with their exhortations to things like spanking children, right, as a form of discipline and correction. And, you know, I think that we generally in our society have a commitment to the notion that at least a large number of problems can be dealt with through violence. And I'm just curious from your perspective, especially in like the activist circles that you have had a lot of contact with, do you feel like the left has sufficiently distanced itself from that underlying value, that idea that you can use some form of violence to address problems, to really have at least one side of our politics starting to have the conversation you're wanting to have?
Dude, I gotta say, like, I would have largely considered myself and was almost like willing to accept the label that I was semi-left or I don't know how to put it, but we think in those ideas. And it's like, of course, like I'm an extreme left ideology. But the more I'm around left ideology, I'm like, I am not this.
Yeah.
Because that is the big issue that is pushing me away, is this feeling that it's a fight to be the oppressor, not end oppression. So even with your idea of justice is to put someone into a system which you claim is inhumane, you are by default just arguing to be the oppressor and arguing to be the one that actually has power. And that does nothing in the long run to change the fundamental problem of oppression and power structures. So like maybe like we're aggressive, maybe violence is like something that's in us and we go to it because that's just the ape in us coming out, and we got to say, okay, in our hearts, we are stupid apes, but we have to do policies and systems that prevent us from being stupid apes.
Yeah, I mean, you know, it's interesting because, you know, I am, I suppose, inclined to think of the left as kind of like the more enlightened side of our society. And, you know, maybe there's a certain arrogance and myopia and sort of thinking about it in those terms. And I'm certainly not someone who thinks of like ideas and knowledge as, you know, ascending in like a direct upward line. But to the extent that I do think there are a lot of sort of enlightened or considered at least values that operate on the left, and even I would say on the far left, the fact that this side of our politics still hasn't let go of this sort of like basic will to power sort of issue is, you know, it says a lot about what we can hope to achieve on questions like this, because if the left hasn't moved that far, then how much has society in general moved from the basic value, the basic commitment to the idea that you can handle problems through violence?
Well, so but violence works, right? So violence does work in a temporary fashion. So if we're always in this short-term thinking or what will make tomorrow better, in a certain weird aspect, you can rationalize that violence will make tomorrow better. And it will make tomorrow better, but it will make better than today, but it will make 10 years from now worse than today. So, like, I don't know how broadening of the picture is something to get across or to get people to focus on, as that things are about their fundamental methodology, and we may not always like the outcomes.
I mean, I'm just curious, to your mind, just from a pure strategy perspective. I mean, how do you think, for persons who are concerned about these more underlying issues, what is the way to engage? Because I know this has been sort of my experience, and I imagine it has been yours, that like when you're not prepared to sip the Kool-Aid, whichever side you're standing on, right, things do not go well. And suddenly whatever sort of like commitment to enlightenment or free discourse or the importance of ideas that challenge the norm, right? And I think those discourses exist on both sides of our politics in terms of their own sort of self-identity. But all of that really disappears once you start challenging whatever happens to be gospel in whichever political context you're in. And so,
yeah,
so how do you engage that?
I mean, I was in that policing. I don't know. I'm the last person to ask. I mean, I feel like I'm failing miserably.
I mean, there's no question we're failing miserably. I'm just curious, are there any conclusions you've reached at this point, just in terms of lessons learned? This won't work.
Okay, well, I have a fundamental philosophical methodology to what I do. I just don't know whether it will work or not. And that's my anecdotal experience dealing with millennials and younger. And I think the literature also supports this idea of authentic leadership being the prevailing trait that people will care about in the next coming decades. So
what does that mean?
And so authentic leadership means to be saying things, like being human, not trying to be tough and always be right, to be vulnerable, to be human, to make errors. And that's kind of the basic idea of authentic leadership in leadership theory, is that these old ideas of somebody being like this patriarchal figure,
sure, yeah,
and appealing to authority won't work anymore. So what they will actually follow is someone that they think is more human and is honest about their flaws and can just be open.
When we say
so
they, who do we mean? No, I mean,
I future generations. Yeah.
I mean, I think there is
the age of technology.
Yeah, no, I'm just thinking, it does. I do think there's fertile soil for that sort of approach on certainly the left side of our politics. I think the experience of Trump suggests that the right is not quite there yet. But I do think there's fertile ground on the left side of our politics where they already sort of hold values that reject that sort of patriarchal view of leadership. Because if you don't believe there's like these stable, objective, overarching moral truths, then the patriarch figure really has no purpose.
Right. To upset power, to challenge power. And it's almost like what we were taught, like philosophically. Somehow we lost it in our roots. I mean, America is about revolution and challenging power. I mean, at least in the common zeitgeist of thinking about it, like, yeah, it was colonialism and it was destructive. But I mean, from its viewpoint towards England, it was about revolution and challenging power, and codifying in the Constitution means to always challenge power. And now we've become nationalistic and don't want to challenge power. And if we stay true to our actual conservative, supposedly American patriotic roots, we would be doing these things that I'm talking about, of constantly challenging power. And when that's true, that means me too. Challenge me, question everything I say. I am not an authority figure to go to. Part of the authenticism is to say I am wrong as much as anybody else.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of wonder if I don't want to go too much longer to try to stay within our aspirational time frame here, but I do kind of wonder if the left needs to make some sort of reconciliation with, I think, some of the Enlightenment ideals that it thinks it's rejected but actually hasn't. In which case, I think that reconciliation could set it on a path for thinking more deeply about methodology, because at least they would like have a theoretical basis again from which to address the problem of method. And so the idea of like the inherent dignity, the inherent equality of human beings, like, you know, acknowledging that some of these ideals are rather sort of Eurocentric in their construction, that, you know, maybe starting with a sort of reconciliation of some of those ideas, we can move towards a more effective method on these issues.
Yeah, and so maybe that's why, getting out of here fast, I'm trying to challenge the power structure more, even in who we're talking about in our common idols, like Bernie Sanders, who has no criminal justice plan whatsoever. The ideas that he's put out, I sent out a string of tweets today if anybody wants to look at them, but they're nonsense. You know, they're the common platitudes that we think are the solutions because of conventional wisdom, but they're not scientifically based. They don't have a consistent methodology of their fundamental philosophies. And there are things that a lot of them have been proven to not work at all in the past, like fighting for diversity of police, which doesn't do anything but change the face of the oppressor. So, like, you haven't thought about your process enough to know that that's ridiculous. NWA told you that.
They haven't even thought about their principles enough, right? Because, like, the left doesn't believe race is a thing, supposedly. But if you put officers of a different race, and somehow that race will drive a different result, right? And it's like, yo, are you listening to yourself? Are you listening? Who wrote this idea down? But, you know, I guess the real challenge you're going to have, Mike, is convincing people that an independent senator from Vermont hasn't figured out the solution to our policing problems.
Why is that hard? Please, why is that hard?
Because he's seen the right movies, and, you know, everybody knows Vermont is the great laboratory of police reform.
I figured it out then. We got to make a movie.